What if the moment you gained everything you ever wanted was the exact moment you lost everything that truly mattered? For millionaire Liam Sterling, the signature on a multi-billion-dollar contract was supposed to be the pinnacle of his life. But miles away, his pregnant wife Isabella was fighting a battle alone, a battle he promised he'd be there for. He thought he was building a legacy. He never imagined that legacy would be broadcast on live television, a spectacle of his own making that would bring him to his knees. This isn't a story about wealth. It's a story about the true cost of ambition and a love fighting to survive the wreckage. The silence in their penthouse apartment was a living entity. It breathed in the sterile air circulated by a state-of-the-art HVAC system and settled over the plush cream-colored furniture like a fine layer of dust. For Isabella Sterling, this silence had become her most constant companion, a stark contrast to the boisterous, laughter-filled life she had once shared with her husband Liam. Liam. Even his name now felt distant, a word whispered in the hollow chambers of her memory. He was a man forged in the crucible of ambition, his eyes perpetually fixed on the shimmering horizon of the next big deal. He moved through the world with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, a titan of Wall Street who saw life as a series of strategic acquisitions. And she, Isabella, had been his most prized one. She remembered their beginning, a whirlwind romance that felt like a fairy tale. He had pursued her with a single-minded intensity that had been both flattering and overwhelming. He'd promised her the world, and in many ways he had delivered. Their home, perched atop a skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan, offered a panoramic view of a city that lay at their feet. Her wardrobe was a curated collection of couture, her days a leisurely procession of charity luncheons and gallery openings. She was living a life most people could only dream of, yet she had never felt more like a bird in a gilded cage. Now, at 8.5 months pregnant, the gilded bars of her cage felt more constricting than ever. Her world had shrunk to the confines of their apartment, her days measured not in social engagements, but in the fluttering kicks of the life growing inside her. A son, their son, a tiny being she already loved with a ferocity that startled her. She waddled over to the nursery, a room that was a testament to both her love and her loneliness. She had designed it herself, a serene oasis of soft blues and gentle whites. A hand-carved crib from Italy stood in the center, a fluffy, cloud-like mobile hanging above it. Every tiny detail, from the hand-stitched quilt to the row of classic children's books lining the shelves, had been chosen with meticulous care. It was a room waiting for a life to begin, a family to be complete. But as she stood in the doorway, a familiar ache settled in her chest. A family she thought required more than just a mother and a child. It required a father. Liam had been physically present for most of her pregnancy, but his mind had been elsewhere. He was consumed by what he called the deal of a lifetime, a merger that would not only cement his legacy, but would also catapult his company into the stratosphere. He spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones, his eyes gleaming with a passion she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. "This is it, Izzy," he'd said to her just this morning, his voice buzzing with an almost manic energy. He was already dressed in a bespoke suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his phone pressed to his ear. "This is for us, for our son. He'll never have to want for anything." She had simply nodded her hand, resting on the swell of her belly. What she wanted to say was, "He will want for his father," but the words had died on her lips. She had learned long ago that competing with Liam's ambition was a losing battle. He had promised her, though. A promise whispered in the dead of night, his hand tracing lazy circles on her burgeoning stomach. "When the time comes, I'll be there," he had vowed. "Nothing in the world will keep me from seeing our son being born." A promise. One of many that had been broken over the years, chipped away by late-night meetings and last-minute business trips. But this one she had clung to with a desperate hope. This one had to be different. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the city, a sharp, unfamiliar pain shot through her lower back. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. She had been having Braxton Hicks contractions for weeks, but this was different. This was deeper, more insistent. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. Another one came stronger this time, wrapping around her abdomen like a tightening band. She knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that it was time. Her first instinct was to call Liam. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. She dialed his number, the one he had assured her was for emergencies only. It rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. "The person you are trying to reach is unavailable. Please leave a message." She tried again, and again. The same result. A cold dread began to seep into her veins, a dread that had nothing to do with the impending pain of childbirth. He had turned his phone off. He had promised he wouldn't. She sank onto the sofa, the plush cushions offering little comfort. Outside, the sky was darkening, the city lights beginning to twinkle to life. A city of millions, and yet she was utterly, completely alone. The silence of the penthouse was no longer just a companion. It was a threat, a suffocating presence that echoed the emptiness in her heart. The contractions were coming faster now, a relentless rhythm that was pulling her further and further into a storm she would have to weather on her own. And as the first drops of rain began to splatter against the window pane, Isabella Sterling knew that the legacy Liam was so desperately trying to build was being written in this very moment, in the silent, lonely drama of his wife going into labor alone. The storm that had been brewing over the city finally broke, unleashing its fury with a vengeance. Rain lashed against the windows of the penthouse, driven by a wind that howled like a mournful beast. The sky, once a canvas of dusky oranges and purples, was now a roiling mass of black and grey. For Isabella, the storm outside was a mirror to the tempest raging within her. The contractions were no longer gentle reminders. They were powerful, all-consuming waves of pain that stole her breath and left her trembling. She tried to remember the breathing exercises from her prenatal yoga class, but the panic clawing at her throat made it impossible to focus. Inhale, exhale. The simple act of breathing felt like an insurmountable task. She called Liam's office, a desperate last-ditch attempt. A polite but firm secretary informed her that Mr. Sterling was in a very important meeting and could not be disturbed. "Can I take a message?" the secretary had asked, her voice devoid of any real concern. Tell him his wife is in labor," Isabella had managed to say, her voice cracking. She wasn't sure the message would even be delivered. Liam had created a fortress around himself, a fortress designed to keep the world and apparently his family at bay. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. They were tears of pain, of fear, but mostly of a profound and heart-wrenching loneliness. This was the moment she had dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure. The birth of her first child, a moment that was supposed to be shared, a memory to be forged in the crucible of love and support. Instead, she was facing it alone, a solitary soldier on a terrifying battlefield. A sudden, fierce contraction brought a cry to her lips. She doubled over, clutching a decorative pillow to her chest, as if it could absorb some of the pain. It was in that moment of utter despair that she heard a tentative knock on her door. "Isabella, are you okay in there?" It was Maria, her neighbor, from the apartment across the hall. Maria was a woman in her late 60s, a retired nurse with a kind face and eyes that held the wisdom of a life fully lived. She had been a quiet but constant presence in Isabella's life since she had moved in, always ready with a warm smile or a plate of homemade cookies. Isabella, with great effort, managed to get to her feet and open the door. The sight of Maria's concerned face was like a beacon in the darkness. "Oh, you poor dear Maria," said her eyes, taking in Isabella's tear-streaked face and the way she was clutching her belly. "It's time, isn't it?" Isabella could only nod, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. "Where's your husband?" Maria asked, her voice gentle but with an undercurrent of disapproval. "He's in a meeting," Isabella whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. Maria's lips thinned. "A meeting," she repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of a meeting that was more important than the birth of his child. "Well, we're not waiting for him. Go and get your hospital bag. I'll call for a car." While Maria was on the phone, her voice firm and commanding as she arranged for a car service that would brave the storm, Isabella's mind drifted to another man in another place. Miles away in the hushed, opulent dining room of Per Se, a restaurant that boasted 3 Michelin stars and a view of Central Park that was almost as breathtaking as its prices, Liam Sterling was at the height of his power. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and success. He sat at the head of a long, polished table, surrounded by the steely-eyed titans of finance he was about to make his partners. The murmur of conversation was a symphony of power and influence, a language Liam understood better than any other. He laughed at a joke, his voice smooth and confident. He swirled the deep red wine in his glass, a vintage that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was in his element, the master of his universe. His personal phone, the one Isabella had been desperately calling, lay dormant in his briefcase, switched off as per his strict no distractions policy during important negotiations. His work phone, however, was on the table, a sleek black monolith that was his true lifeline. The final details of the merger were being ironed out, the culmination of months of ruthless planning and sleepless nights. The prize was within his grasp, a multi-billion-dollar empire that would make the name Sterling synonymous with power. He felt a thrill course through him, a potent cocktail of adrenaline and ambition. This, he thought, was what it felt like to be alive. He raised his glass, the crystal clinking against those of his soon-to-be partners. To the future, he said, his voice ringing with triumph. At that exact moment, back in the hallway of their apartment building, Maria was helping a trembling Isabella into her coat. "The car is downstairs," she said, her voice a soothing balm on Isabella's frayed nerves. "We're going to get you to the hospital, my dear. You are not alone. I'm with you." As they stepped into the elevator, the polished steel doors sliding shut, Isabella took one last look at the door to her apartment, her home, her gilded cage. It looked cold and empty, a monument to a life that was about to be irrevocably changed. She was leaving it behind, stepping out into the storm, with or without the man who had promised to be her anchor. The journey to motherhood had begun, a journey she was now forced to take with a kind stranger instead of the love of her life. And as the elevator descended, she couldn't help but wonder, if her marriage would survive the night. The journey to Lenox Hill Hospital was a nightmare. The city, usually a vibrant tapestry of light and sound, was now a chaotic mess. The storm had transformed the streets into raging rivers, the wind so fierce that it shook the car. The driver, a stoic man with a grim set to his jaw, navigated the treacherous roads with a skill that was both admirable and terrifying. With every lurch of the car, a fresh wave of pain washed over Isabella. She squeezed Maria's hand, her knuckles white. The older woman murmured words of encouragement, her presence a fragile shield against the storm both outside and inside her. Between the searing contractions, Isabella's mind reeled back to a happier time. A sun-drenched afternoon in Central Park, not long after they had found out she was pregnant. They had been lying on a blanket, Liam's head in her lap. He had been tracing the curve of her still flat stomach, his eyes soft with a vulnerability she rarely saw. "I'm going to be there, Izzy," he had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going to be like my father. I'm going to be there for every scraped knee, every soccer game, every heartbreak. And I'm going to be there to see our son take his first breath. I promise." His father, a man who had been a ghost in Liam's life, a cautionary tale of a brilliant but absent patriarch who had prioritized his business over his family. A man Liam had sworn he would never become. A tear escaped her eye and traced a cold path down her cheek. The memory, once a source of comfort, was now a cruel taunt. The promise, once a sacred vow, was now just another broken piece of their shattered life. Back at Per Se, the atmosphere was jubilant. The deal was done. The contracts were being signed, the expensive pens gliding across the thick, creamy paper. Liam felt a surge of triumph, so powerful it was almost dizzying. He had done it. He had conquered his own personal Everest. His secondary phone, a cheap burner he kept for emergencies of a different kind, buzzed in his briefcase. He ignored it. Nothing could pierce the bubble of his success. He was on top of the world, a king surveying his newly acquired kingdom. He ordered another bottle of champagne, a vintage that cost a small fortune, to celebrate. Meanwhile, Isabella and Maria finally arrived at the hospital. The emergency room was a scene of controlled chaos. The storm had brought a flood of patients, and the staff was stretched thin. Maria, with her years of nursing experience, took charge, her voice cutting through the noise and confusion. They were finally shown to a delivery room, a sterile, impersonal space that did little to soothe Isabella's frayed nerves. A young, tired-looking doctor came in to examine her. Her face was professional, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The baby is in a posterior position. It's not dangerous, but it can make for a longer, more painful labor. And your blood pressure is a little high. We need to monitor you closely." The words hit Isabella with the force of a physical blow. A longer, more painful labor. And she was already so exhausted, so emotionally drained. The thought of enduring hours, more of this alone, was almost too much to bear. She looked at Maria, her eyes pleading. The older woman squeezed her hand, her touch a lifeline in a sea of despair. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice a steady anchor in Isabella's storm. "You are stronger than you think." But as another contraction ripped through her, stronger and more brutal than any that had come before, Isabella wasn't so sure. She felt like she was on the brink of a precipice, staring down into an abyss of pain and fear. And the man who was supposed to be holding her hand, The man who had promised to be her rock was miles away, celebrating a victory that had cost him everything. Liam Sterling felt invincible. The ink was dry, the handshakes exchanged, the future secured. He and his new partners had moved from the rarefied air of Per Se to a sleek, exclusive cocktail lounge downtown. The mood was electric, a palpable hum of testosterone and triumph. The world was his oyster, and he had just cracked it wide open. He finally retrieved his personal phone from his briefcase, the celebratory champagne making him feel magnanimous. He'd give Isabella a quick call, share the good news. She wouldn't understand the intricacies of the deal, of course, but she would understand the result, a life of unimaginable luxury for their son. He powered it on. The screen lit up, and then it began to vibrate uncontrollably, a frantic, desperate buzzing. A torrent of notifications flooded the screen. 37 missed calls from Isabella, 14 missed calls from home, 5 missed calls from Maria neighbor. Then came the text messages, a cascade of frantic words that made the blood freeze in his veins. Isabella, Liam, it's time. Please answer. Isabella, the contractions are getting stronger. I can't reach you. Isabella, Liam, I'm scared. Where are you, Maria? Neighbor, Mr. Sterling, this is Maria from across the hall. Isabella is in labor. I am taking her to Lenox Hill Hospital. The storm is very bad. Isabella, the doctor says the baby is posterior. Please, Liam, I need you. The final text, sent over an hour ago, was just one word. Please. The laughter and celebratory chatter of the lounge faded into a dull roar. The expensive champagne suddenly tasted like acid in his mouth. A cold, creeping dread began to snake its way up his spine, a chilling counterpoint to the warmth of the alcohol. Everything all right, Liam? One of his new partners asked, clapping him on the back. Liam couldn't speak. He stared at the phone, at the litany of his own failure. He had been so consumed by the future, he had completely abandoned the present. The most important moment of his life was happening without him, and it was entirely his own fault. He stumbled to his feet, knocking over his chair. I have to go, he muttered, his voice hoarse. He rushed out of the lounge and into the street, the rain plastering his expensive suit to his skin. He hailed a cab, his hands shaking as he gave the driver the address for Lenox Hill Hospital. The city was still in the grip of the storm. The traffic, a tangled mess. The journey was agonizingly slow, every red light a fresh torment. He tried calling Isabella's phone. It went straight to voicemail. He tried Maria's number. No answer. The dread in his gut twisted into a knot of pure terror. He was a man who was used to being in control, to bending the world to his will. But in this moment, he was utterly powerless, a prisoner in a yellow cab, crawling through a city that seemed to be conspiring against him. Meanwhile, back at the lounge, he had just fled. The celebration continued. The television above the bar, which had been showing a sports game, was switched to the local news. The main story, of course, was the storm. The storm, which has been upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane, is causing widespread flooding and power outages across the city, the news anchor said, her face grim. We have live footage from our reporter on the scene, near Lenox Hill Hospital, where a crane has collapsed at a nearby construction site due to the high winds. The screen cut to a chaotic scene. Rain was lashing down, the wind whipping through the streets. Fire trucks and ambulances crowded the area, their flashing lights painting a terrifying tableau. The camera zoomed in on the wreckage of a massive construction crane which had buckled and fallen, crushing a section of the street below. It is a scene of utter devastation, the reporter said, her voice strained over the roar of the wind. Emergency services are working tirelessly to secure the area and search for any potential victims. The camera panned across the debris-strewn street, lingering on the flashing lights of an ambulance. For a split second, something caught the light. A small, brightly colored object lying amidst the chaos and the rain. It was a hand-knitted baby blanket, a whimsical pattern of blue and white clouds. A blanket that was identical to the one Isabella had spent months knitting, the one she had lovingly packed in her hospital bag. Liam's cab was stuck in a gridlock of emergency vehicles a few blocks from the hospital. The air was filled with the frantic wail of sirens. Impatient and terrified, he threw a handful of cash at the driver and got out, breaking into a desperate run. The rain was relentless, soaking him to the bone, but he barely noticed. His mind was a maelstrom of fear and self-recrimination. He finally reached the chaotic scene he had glimpsed on the television. Police lines had been set up, and the area was swarming with firefighters and paramedics. The fallen crane was a monstrous metal skeleton, a monument to the destructive power of the storm. He tried to push through the police line, his voice a desperate croak. "My wife. She's at the hospital." Lennox Hill, a stern-faced police officer, blocked his path. "Sir, you need to stay back. This is an active emergency scene." "You don't understand." Liam pleaded, his carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. "My wife is in labor. I need to get to her." It was then that he saw it. Not on a television screen this time, but with his own eyes. Lying on a gurney, being loaded into an ambulance, was a figure. It was an older woman, her face pale, a nasty gash on her forehead. It was Maria. And clutched in her hand was the corner of a familiar hand-knitted baby blanket, with a pattern of blue and white clouds. The world tilted on its axis. The sirens, the rain, the shouting, it all faded into a deafening roar in his ears. The blanket, Maria, the collapsed crane. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They must have been caught in the collapse. Maria had been injured. But where was Isabella? He scanned the chaotic scene, his eyes wild with panic. He saw paramedics working on other injured people, but he didn't see his wife. He saw the mangled wreckage of a car crushed beneath a steel girder. A car service, the one Maria had called for them. The air was sucked from his lungs. A guttural sound of pure agony escaped his lips. The strength drained from his body, his legs buckling beneath him. Liam Sterling, the titan of Wall Street, the man who had just conquered the financial world, collapsed onto the wet, grimy pavement, overwhelmed by a wave of guilt so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical blow. He had done this. His ambition, his obsession, his broken promise, it had all led to this. He had been chasing a legacy, and in doing so, he had potentially destroyed his entire world. He had left his wife to face the storm alone, and the storm had swallowed her whole. He lay on the ground, oblivious to the rain and the chaos around him, a broken man, weeping for a life he had so carelessly gambled away. The image of the baby blanket, a symbol of his wife's love and his own failure, was burned into his mind. The deal of a lifetime had become the failure of a lifetime. And in that moment of utter devastation, Liam Sterling knew that no amount of money or power could ever absolve him of his guilt. He had gained a kingdom, but he had lost his queen, and with her the heir he had never even had the chance to meet. A paramedic knelt beside Liam, his voice a distant, muffled sound through the roaring in Liam's ears. "Sir, sir, can you hear me? Are you injured?" Liam's injuries were invisible, etched onto his soul. He couldn't respond, couldn't form words. His mind was a slideshow of horrors. The mangled car, the wail of the sirens, Maria's pale face, and the small, brightly colored baby blanket, a beacon of love in a landscape of devastation. He scrambled to his feet, a wild, desperate energy surging through him. He had to know. He grabbed the paramedic's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "My wife," he gasped the words, tearing from his throat. "Isabella Sterling. She was with the woman on that gurney. The blanket. Was she—" He couldn't finish the sentence. To speak the words would be to make them real. The paramedic, a young woman with weary, compassionate eyes, saw the sheer terror on his face. She understood this was not a man in physical distress, but one whose world had just imploded. "Stay here, sir. Let me check," she said, her voice firm but kind. The moments that followed were the longest of Liam's life. He stood shivering in the torrential rain, a ghost amidst the flashing lights and frantic activity. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who moved markets with a single word. Yet here he was utterly powerless, waiting for a stranger to deliver the verdict on his life. He saw his future branching into two distinct paths, one of unbearable, unending grief, and another he didn't dare imagine. The paramedic returned her expression unreadable. Liam's heart stopped. "Sir," she began, and he braced himself for the blow. "We have a record of an Isabella Sterling. She was admitted to Lenox Hill's maternity ward over an hour ago. She's on the 5th floor." She paused, then added, clarifying the image that had shattered him. "The other woman, Maria, was with her. It seems Ms. Sterling forgot something in the car. Maria went back to get it for her just as the crane came down. Your wife was never outside. She's safe. Safe." The word didn't register at first. It was alien, impossible. Then it crashed over him in a dizzying, nauseating wave. Relief so potent and absolute buckled his knees again. It wasn't the clean, pure relief of joy, but a messy, agonizing relief, intertwined with the acid of his guilt. Isabella was safe. His son or daughter was safe. He hadn't killed them. The thought was so overwhelming, he choked, gasping for air. He didn't deserve to breathe. He mumbled his thanks, his voice hoarse, and began a desperate, stumbling run towards the hospital entrance. This was his walk of shame. His bespoke suit, now soaked and stained, clung to him like a shroud. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his face pale and gaunt. He pushed through the automatic doors and into the sterile brightness of the lobby, a wild creature invading a place of healing. People stared, nurses, orderlies, other waiting families. They saw a man who looked broken, and they were right. He found the elevators, his reflection in the polished steel doors, a grotesque caricature of the man he was just hours ago. He ascended to the 5th floor in a metal box, each floor a new level of his personal hell. He found the maternity ward, a place of hushed joy and new beginnings, and it felt like a sacrilege for him to be there. He approached the nurse's station, his voice a raw whisper, as he asked for Isabella's room. The nurse gave him the number, her gaze lingering on him with professional curiosity. He walked down the corridor, his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the linoleum. He stopped outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle, trembling. He was terrified. What would he find? What could he possibly say? "Sorry, I missed the birth of our child. The merger was a success." The thought was so vile it made him want to retch. He could hear the faint, steady beep of a monitor. From within, a sound that confirmed life, a life he had so carelessly abandoned. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing glass, he pushed the door open. The room was quiet, dimly lit. And there she was, his wife. She was propped up in the hospital bed, her beautiful face pale and utterly exhausted, her dark hair damp against the pillow. Her eyes were closed, and in a small, clear bassinet beside her bed lay a miracle. A tiny, perfect baby, swaddled in a standard-issue hospital blanket, his face serene in sleep. His son. A wave of love so fierce and profound it was physically painful, washed over Liam. It was a love tainted by the deepest shame he had ever known. He had missed it. He had missed the single greatest moment of his life. He took a hesitant step into the room, the soft click of the door latch sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. Isabella's eyes fluttered open. They were not the soft, loving eyes that had captivated him years ago. They were cold, hard, and as empty as a winter sky. She looked at him, her gaze passing over him, as if he were a stranger, a piece of furniture. Then she turned her head, fixing her eyes on the window, where the storm was finally mercifully beginning to subside. Isabella, he breathed the name an apology in itself. I'm so sorry. She didn't respond. There were no screams, no accusations, no tears. There was only an absolute, profound silence. A silence that was a living thing, a wall of ice she had erected around herself, and he knew instantly he would never be able to breach it. She adjusted the thin hospital blanket over her legs, a small, deliberate movement that screamed her rejection of him. He took another agonizing step, his eyes falling on his son. He was so small, so impossibly perfect. He's beautiful, Liam said, his voice cracking. What's his name? Isabella's voice, when she finally spoke, was flat, devoid of all emotion, as if she were reciting a line from a script. Theodore, she said, her eyes still fixed on the window. It means gift of God. She paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Then she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, he was a gift to me. The implication was a dagger to his heart. To me, not to us. In that moment, he ceased to be a husband or a father. He was just the biological donor, the man whose eyes perhaps the boy might share, but whose life he was not a part of. The next few days were a blur of agonizing penance. He did not leave. He cancelled every meeting, ignored the hundreds of frantic calls and texts from his partners. His multi-billion-dollar triumph was now nothing but digital noise. He sat in the hard plastic visitor's chair in the corner of her room, a silent sentinel at the gates of the family he had been exiled from. He watched her learn to be a mother, with a quiet, focused intensity that excluded him completely. When he tried to help, offering to get her water or another pillow, she would ignore him and do it herself. When he dared to approach the bassinet, she would subtly shift her body, a silent guardian, protecting her son from the man who had abandoned them. He found Maria's room on the 3rd floor. She had a concussion and a cast on her broken arm. The sight of her injured because of his negligence was another twist of the knife. He stammered his apologies, his gratitude, his shame. She looked at him, her kind eyes filled not with anger, but with a deep, weary disappointment. You have a beautiful family, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice weak but firm. Don't lose it. The day they were to be discharged, Liam had arranged everything. A luxury car service, a top-of-the-line car seat. He'd had an assistant purchase a path cleared for their return home. He thought foolishly that these logistical comforts might mean something. As a nurse wheeled Isabella out with Theodore nestled in her arms, Liam held the door open. Isabella stopped at the threshold, her body angled away from him. She looked at him then, her eyes meeting his. For the first time since that first night, they were clear, resolved, and utterly devoid of love. "I want you to move out," she said. Her voice wasn't angry or hysterical. It was quiet, calm, and unyielding. It was the voice of a woman who had faced the worst alone and had discovered her own strength in the process. "I need space. I need to figure out how to be a mother. And I need to do it without you." Each word was a precise, calculated blow. It was not a punishment born of rage, but a consequence born of his actions. It was her survival plan. And he, Liam, was not a part of it. He could only nod, the motion stiff, his throat too tight to speak. He watched as she allowed the nurse to help her into the waiting car. He watched her buckle their son, whose name he hadn't chosen, into the car seat he hadn't been there to buy. He watched the door close, shutting him out. And then he stood alone on the curb, in his now dry but permanently ruined suit, as the car pulled away, disappearing into the city traffic. He was Liam Sterling, a millionaire, a titan, a success. And he had absolutely nothing at all. The penthouse, once a symbol of his ascent, became Liam's gilded purgatory. The silence that had once been Isabella's tormentor was now his own, a constant humming entity that mocked him from every corner of the vast empty space. It echoed in the marble foyer, where he'd last kissed her goodbye, a perfunctory peck on the cheek, as he rushed toward his destiny. It settled over the plush sofa, where she had labored alone. Every object was a monument to his failure, every room a chapter in the story of his downfall. He did as she asked. He packed a single suitcase, the movements automated and numb, and checked into a sterile suite at the Four Seasons. It was the kind of luxury he was accustomed to, but the high thread count sheets felt like sandpaper, and the panoramic view of the city felt like a condemnation. He was surrounded by wealth, yet spiritually bankrupt. The day after he moved out, he sat on the edge of his unmade hotel bed and made the most important call of his career. Not to a partner or a client, but to his broker. "Sell it," Liam said, his voice flat. "Sell what, Liam?" "The tech stock. It's up 3 points." "Everything," Liam clarified, his gaze fixed on a framed abstract painting on the wall, a swirl of chaotic colors that mirrored the tempest in his soul. "My entire stake in the new merger. All of it. Liquidate my position." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. His broker stammered, convinced Liam was having a breakdown, that the pressure had finally cracked him. He warned of the consequences, the market reaction, the fortune he'd be walking away from. Liam listened unmoved. The numbers, once the gospel by which he lived, were now just meaningless figures. He had been chasing a legacy of glass and steel, only to discover that the only legacy that mattered was one of flesh and blood, and it was a legacy he had nearly shattered. With the machinery of his old life dismantled, he began the most difficult project he had ever undertaken, the slow, painstaking reconstruction of his family. He began to court his wife again, not with the grand, sweeping gestures of their early romance, but with the quiet, humble acts of a penitent. He knew flowers and diamonds would be an insult. Instead, he focused on the things that mattered. He remembered she loved a specific artisanal sourdough from a bakery in Soho, so he had a fresh loaf delivered every morning. He knew she was too exhausted to cook, so he arranged for meals from her favorite healthy restaurant to arrive each evening timed perfectly for after she put the baby down. He sent diapers, formula, organic baby clothes, a silent, steady stream of support that asked for nothing in return. And every single day, without fail, a single white rose would arrive at her door. No card, no message, just the rose. It was a symbol of his apology, a daily renewal of his vow to be better. He asked for only one thing: to see his son. After a week of his silent offerings, she relented. Her text message was brief and devoid of warmth, but it was a door cracked open. 1 hour. Every day at 4 p.m. Don't be late. That hour became the focal point of his existence. He would arrive at the penthouse, his heart pounding, a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The first few times he'd find Theodore asleep in his crib, a tiny perfect creature who was a stranger to him. Liam would just stand there, watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's chest, mesmerized. A love so fierce and primal it physically ached, swelled within him, immediately followed by the crushing weight of his guilt. He learned. Clumsily at first, his large, capable hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts, fumbled with the delicate tabs of a diaper. He struggled to warm a bottle to the perfect temperature, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a titan of industry, reduced to a bumbling novice by a 7-pound infant. Isabella would watch him from the doorway of the nursery, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of neutrality. She rarely spoke. Her silence was a wall, and he knew that every correctly fastened diaper, every successfully warmed bottle, was just a single tiny chip against its massive surface. But he kept showing up, on time, every single day. One afternoon, about a month after Theodore was born, the baby was inconsolable. A storm of frantic, piercing cries filled the apartment. Liam had tried everything he had learned. He'd fed him, changed him, swaddled him. He paced the floor, rocking his son, whispering nonsense. But the wailing only intensified. Panic began to set in. He was failing at this too. The one thing he was allowed to do, the one connection he had, and he was failing. The baby's cries felt like a judgment, a raw, unfiltered verdict on his fatherhood. Frustration and despair welled up in him, and his own eyes began to burn with tears. Suddenly, Isabella was there. She moved past him without a word and gently took Theodore from his arms. The transfer was fluid, instinctual. She held the baby against her shoulder, her hand rubbing his back in a slow, steady, knowing rhythm. She began to hum a soft, low melody that Liam had never heard before. It was a sound of pure comfort, of maternal love. Within moments, Theodore's cries subsided into whimpers, and then, with a shuddering sigh, his tiny body relaxed against his mother's. Liam stood by a useless spectator, his heart feeling like it was being squeezed in a vice. He was an outsider in this sacred circle of two. The image of her effortless, innate connection with their son was the most painful illustration yet of everything he had missed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words raw and broken. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. For you. For him." Isabella didn't look at him, her cheek resting on the top of Theodore's head. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, almost carried away by the humming. "He had your eyes. You know," she said. "The first time they placed him in my arms after everything, the first thing I saw was that he has your eyes." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation back into her heart, but it was a connection. It was an acknowledgement that he was a part of this child, a part of this story. It was the first crack in the wall of her silence, the first glimmer of a future he had believed was lost to him forever. He didn't dare speak, afraid that any word he uttered would shatter the fragile peace of the moment. The reconstruction continued brick by painstaking brick. The seasons turned. The crisp air of autumn gave way to the biting cold of winter. The 1-hour visits sometimes stretched to 2. Isabella began to leave the door unlocked for him. Sometimes she would make a pot of coffee and leave a mug out for him on the counter. Small gestures, but for Liam they were seismic shifts. One evening in December, after he had rocked Theodore to sleep and laid him gently in his crib, he found Isabella in the living room. The lights were low, and she was sitting on the sofa, a large leather-bound album open on her lap. It was their wedding album. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. He sat down on the other end of the sofa, leaving a careful, respectful distance between them. Together, they looked through the photos in silence. There they were, younger, their faces alight with a naive, uncomplicated joy. Liam saw the man. He had been so confident, so certain of the future, so oblivious to the true meaning of commitment. Each photo was a ghost of a promise he had failed to keep. When they reached the last page, a candid shot of them dancing lost in their own world, Isabella slowly closed the album. She turned to him, her eyes clear and steady in the lamplight. The cold, empty hardness was gone. In its place was a deep, profound sadness, but beneath it there was a flicker of something else, something he had been starving for. Hope. "I don't know if I can ever forget that night, Liam," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but each word was clear and deliberate. "What it felt like to be so alone. That will always be a part of us now." He nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. He accepted her truth. It was a scar he had given them both. But she continued, taking a slow breath. "I watch you with him. I see you trying. And I think for Theodore's sake, and for ours," her voice wavered for just a second, "I am willing to try to forgive." It was not a triumphant declaration. It was not a fairy tale ending where all was magically erased. It was something far more precious. It was a choice, a difficult, courageous choice to begin again. Liam felt a tremor run through him, a release of months of tension and fear. He reached out his hand, hesitating in the space between them, before he gently took hers. Her fingers were cool, but they didn't pull away. They rested in his a fragile truce. They sat there for a long time in the quiet of the penthouse as the snow began to fall outside, blanketing the city in a clean white sheath. They were no longer the millionaire and his beautiful wife. They were just a man and a woman, a father and a mother. Two scarred people who had weathered a devastating storm and were now tentatively facing the dawn. The legacy Liam Sterling would leave behind would not be etched on the skyline of New York City. It would be built here in the quiet, patient, and loving reconstruction of his family. Liam's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest fortunes are not measured in dollars, but in moments. The moments we show up, the promises we keep, the love we nurture. He nearly lost it all in his relentless pursuit of a world that glittered, only to find true wealth in the quiet dignity of a second chance. Their journey is far from over the echoes of that stormy night, a permanent part of their story. But in the ruins of a broken promise, they are rebuilding something real, something resilient, something worth more than any empire. What did you think of Liam and Isabella's story? Does a mistake of this magnitude deserve forgiveness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if their story moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the depths of the human heart. Thank you for watching.